G'day there. This is the first presentation of graphics, history and fundamentals, and this will help you out within this course of V.R.O.W. So let's start with graphics. Now, when I think of graphics and some of the fundamental things that I learnt in terms of proportion, form, line, etc. I started off with life drawing. So with life drawing, you generally start off with a 5-minute or 30-second sketch. Then you proceed to a 3-minute to 5-minute shading session, and then you proceed again to maybe like a half-hour full-on rendering where you render out the lights and the reflections and all that sort of stuff. And then you go into abstraction after that when you want to commit something to canvas or something of that action. This pretty much mirrors what happens within the visualization process to a greater or lesser extent. And what we'll be focusing on is realistic rendering in this course. And we'll also be looking at abstraction, especially of wind phenomena, that sort of thing. So, getting back to our life drawing analogy, we start off here. You'll see from the left, proceeding to the right, what you've got there is we get the approximate proportions of the arm there. You can see the bicep, and you can kind of see the hand there just being roughed out with the shoulder and the forearm in total. Now, you do that just so you can roughly get the sense of proportion, and you just have a nice light white line weight there. And with that, what you do is you proceed on to adding a little bit more form, so it looks like you've blocked out something that kind of starts to resemble something that's going to be three-dimensional. So there you can see some of the high points. You can see that the the bicep or the tricep, I don't know the exact anatomy, but the back, the top of the arm there, you can start to see that it's starting to look a little bit 3D. You're starting to anticipate where you're going to start seeing form. So form is 3D and shape is 2D. So with that, you can see that the fingers are starting to get a little bit more definition, and you've gone from a mitt to something that looks like you can make out a thumb and 4 fingers. And then as we proceed to second from the right, you can start to, again, using those outlines, starting to build it up from there. And you're building it up. Essentially what looks like the muscles there, but are just creating more 3D shape. 3D form. And finally, we've got the rendering out of the lighting and the surface finish. So what you might start off with is something which is 30-second sketches. These sketches, typically you've got a model who has some elaborate poses. Here you can see elaborate. It's looking over the shoulder and looking forward, looking backwards, hands up in the air, hands, all sorts of interesting, dynamic sorts of poses. This is a great place to start. These are generally, what I call the cocktail sketches or the back of the napkin sketches. Just something quick and dirty, and enough to start you somewhere. So these aren't the end of where you're going to be, but especially in your folio, these are the things you love to see, as it shows off the journey of what you've learnt and how your final outcome will come into being. So we go generally from this to something like this. So this, it's purely 2D, and it's indicative of, you know, where the shoulders are and where the face is looking and pointing, and, you know, where the hands are and where the feet are. Kind of just getting a rough sort of outline. Here though, here we can clearly see you've got a supine figure, you know, arching the back out and looking away from us. The hair's draped along the floor, and we're starting to see like a little bit of shading coming in here. Really is only indicative of of creating form. It's not even, I would say, not super accurate in terms of like where the light source is, and nor does it have to be. It's kind of there for the reason to figure out and to really flesh out, pardon the pun, what the figure looks like. This is typically a 5-second sketch, whereas the previous ones would be about 30 seconds. So if you've done this before, chances are you've probably participated in life drawing. If not, I highly recommend it, especially if you want to get in the design field. It's one of the fundamental skills to have to really train your hand-eye coordination. I can't recommend it enough. Generally they do it in the city. You can always look online. Like $20. It's a really, really great skill set to have. But yeah, getting back to what you see here, it's, you know, it's pretty loose, pretty rough. 5 minutes, like I said, and you're just building on one of the previous sketches. Yeah, and then we'll go from that to this. This is full-on rendering. Now you can see that really the details, you know, sucking into the rib cage there. You've got casting a shadow, and off the chest you can see it's quite shiny. It's picking up a lot of light, so we've got a shiny surface that tends to be more reflective, and that it reflects a lot of light. Where you've got the opposite is true, so where you've got something that's quite matte and quite dull, that's quite absorbent of light, and that tends to be the opposite of shiny. So we'll cover that in greater detail after the break, but just something to, you know, whether it's rendering in Unreal or rendering in charcoal, as this is the case, the same principles apply. You can see here that the face is looking away from us, and you can really make out some of the muscular definition, especially if you look at the neck. And you can see like dimples, and that's really a higher level of rendering. If we compare back to here, where it's just kind of, we've just got some really basic shadow there, just hatched in there, just so we can get a kind of idea of the form. Here we can really make out, you know, where the belly button is, and you know, even in the chest cavity there, all these sorts of things. And the shoulders, you can really see the inflection inside. So it's just, again, it's a level of refinement and resolution and detailing, probably more to the point. And yeah, this is where we want you to end up with in Unreal. And we want everyone to be on the same page. We want everyone to do like hyper-realistic rendering, and we'll walk you through that. But this is essentially, you know, what you do in life drawing and physically, you know, drawing on a page is essentially the same core principles. Where we'll take it though is one step further, which is abstraction. So abstraction kind of looks like the original hand sketches, but you'll notice with this that you've got quite a bit of detail, although it's simplified. So here you can clearly make out details like the belly button, the nipple, the nose, the hair. And if you remember the first sketches, if we go back all the way to the start, none of that's seen there. And this is because, you know, these are 30-second sketches that will transform into this, that will then, after 5 minutes, transform into this, and this will be a half-hour sort of rendering. And then once you've got this finished, then you go all the way back to this and you figure out a way to simplify this. So the way I tend to think of abstraction is like logo design, in a sense that if you think of any memorable logo, whether it's, think of it like the probably the most memorable one that you've got on your laptops is the Apple logo, right? It's or the Windows logo, one or the other. Windows, it's just 4 squares, and it's the most simplified version of a window. Or the Apple, it's an apple with a little chunk taken out of it. Again, the most simplified form. Sorry, it's not even a form, it's a shape, rather. The most simplified shape. So, you could look at that from, it's instantly recognizable. It's something that we're quite familiar with. And likewise with this abstraction is there, and anyone can see that from a mile away. It's what appears to be a lady with her hand behind her head, standing up or lying down, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's instantly recognizable. And the audience for the abstraction is whoever it wants to be, right? And it's useful for somebody to see instantaneously. Whereas the initial sketches, they're purely for the person who's going to draw the model. So the idea of abstraction, of logo design, why it's simplified and tested and all that sort of stuff, is so that people can instantly have that instant connection. And where we're going with this is we want you to create abstraction in how you show off wind. Now, Dan's going to have a bit more of a lecture on that on Friday, but it's good for you to know that we want people, when they see some sort of abstract visualization of wind, that they know it's wind. And we all want, when you break into groups around week 3, we all want different types of visualization of wind. And we just want it in a simplified, abstract format that works well with, what you've done previously. So, yeah. Now, moving on. We're looking at, or my leadership role in this is to essentially teach you photorealism using a variety of programs. Now, these programs will essentially, the core concepts that I want you to walk away with is that you'll need modeling, materials, and lighting. And yeah, I would put equal weight in all 3. The lighting you won't have as much. Depending on how you set up your scene, you may or may not have as much to play with there. But certainly your modeling materials I'll walk you through, and there'll be a lot of variance through there. So let's just get on with it. So here's modeling. Modeling is separated into 2 areas: polymodeling and NURBS modeling. Now, don't ask me what NURBS stands for, but Dan's going to take you through that on Friday. Polymodeling, however, that's firmly in my wheelhouse. Now, polymodeling, you can see in the top there, it's a model created by what are known as quads, or 4-sided squares. You can see a whole bunch of them on that armchair there. And what it is when you combine those together, then you can lay a texture on top of them. The reason why we model like this is for animation, games, and visualization generally, because it is the simplest form, or simplest way to show off or to capture mathematically a 3D form. And as such, it's really good for real-time rendering, which we will go into a little bit later. But if you want to contrast that, look at below where you've got the piston there. That is a NURBS model. Now, where NURBS models are particularly useful is for manufacturing. So that piston head there, it wouldn't surprise me if a crankshaft fit perfectly in there, and you could CNC or potentially even 3D print that piston head if you wanted to. It would be dimensionally accurate, and there'd be a tolerance that you could apply there. It's particularly good for engineering applications. You could use it in architecture and landscape architecture, industrial design. In fact, NURBS modeling is particularly good for Class A surface modeling. So that's, if you look at any cars, it's, in my humble opinion, the hardest type of modeling. It's certainly, I think, one of the highest paying forms of modeling, outside of being a supermodel. But in all seriousness, you have to calculate really, you've got to calculate curvature and really minute details down to the micron. And that is, I guess, the difference between what's polymodeling is, which is realistically just good for the screen, and what NURBS modeling is. And NURBS modeling is, fit for manufacturer, and you can go down to a couple of hundred microns or less, depending on how you've scaled it. So yeah, really a lot of detail in the NURBS model. Doesn't play that nicely in real time. At the moment, what happens is your NURBS model will typically be converted into a poly model before you can render it. You might think, well, why don't you do that with everything? Why don't you just start with a NURBS model and just do everything with NURBS and then just convert it? And I'd probably caution you against this, doing everything like this, because you'll just end up with way too many polys in the scene. But certainly we expect you to get some NURBS models in there and convert them, just not all of them. Yeah, so we'll move on. So again, poly modeling, as you can see there, we've got three, not resolutions, I guess, 3 levels of detail, or LODs as they're called. So on the left you've got low poly, in the middle medium poly, and on the right high poly. And it's really just defined by how many polys there are, or squares, or quads, as they're generally called there. So as you can see there, they're all 4-sided, and generally they go up exponentially. And if you're looking, like if you had a close-up of the one on the right, it would look quite sharp. It would look quite rounded. If you had a close-up on the one on the left, it would look quite blocky and sharp. And if you're familiar with any of the old video like games, like your Dreamcast or your PlayStation 1 of that sort of ilk, where you started seeing poly models in games, you'd probably be more familiar with one on the left, where the rendering hardware, which was the graphics card, was pretty basic. One in the middle would be something like a PlayStation 3, and your one on your right there would be the latest PlayStation 4 or a PC. Really, the limitations of how many polys you can have in the scene are all dictated by your graphics card, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on. NURBS modeling, on the other hand, it's all a bunch of surfaces that are put together. Now, it's a Ferrari underneath, and I believe a McLaren above that. Now, the great thing about these is that if you have this as a Class A surface, you can take this directly to manufacture. So I would not be surprised if a few of the molds from here, went straight into the machine shop to, create aluminium molds to make carbon fiber bits, or steel molds to make injection molded parts, especially for the plastic bits in the what do you call it? The light fixing the light housing, the headlights. There you go. All that sort of stuff, or the grill, or it could be to make a press, all these sorts of things. So this would have a very fine tolerance, and the curvature would be appropriate for manufacture, and all the light would reflect off there perfectly. So with car design, and we've got V.R.O.W, who's probably the master of this type of modeling. He'll come in a bit later and discuss this in a bit more detail. But this type of modeling is quite good if you need to make things. So Dan's going to be teaching you not how to make cars, but how to make some pretty damn fine models with Rhino and Grasshopper. And yeah, you should be able to take that data and laser cut it and do 3D print it or do whatever you like with it. With really fine detail. So I'll leave that to I'll leave that to the experts. So once you've got these models, then you cover them with material. So this is a complex material in Painter and Designer. Now, doesn't matter if that was a NURBS model or if that was a poly model. You paint them, well, it does matter if it's a NURBS model because you'd have to convert them to polys before you start painting them. So generally I like to work natively in polys, but that doesn't mean you can't bring in NURBS data to paint up like this. You can see quite a few different layers there. So you can see, not only can you see the black and the gold, but you can also see some scratch maps for the gold there, and some little micro details for the black section there. It's really effective illusion. I'll use the term illusion at this time because realistically, it's a 2D material. You've applied some. Sorry, it's a 2D form. It's a 3D model in as so far as it's mathematically a 3D model that the computer program understands, right? But it's it's on a 2D plane. It's on the screen at the moment. It's all an illusion. A very, very cool illusion, but it doesn't look like that in real life. It doesn't exist in real life. But I guess the thing about it is for me seeing that model now, to me it looks like I could touch that and feel the cracks in there, and it really presents in such a way that it looks incredible. And that's what I'd highly recommend everyone aiming to do, is that especially when you're texturing up your models, is you go to that little bit of effort, and you'll see quite a bit of variance in the model that you can kind of see where people's fingerprints are, and where that's been scratched, and where the cracks are broader and more dilapidated, and all these things. And that's really what creates a really impressive scene, like an immersive experience. You don't want people second guessing whether it's real or whether it's not. So getting onto lighting and rendering, this is probably one of the best examples. I'll just copy and paste this. Ah, God. So you don't want me to do it. Alright, so I'm just give me a moment. So I think that is it. Here we go. This isn't exactly the one I wanted to see, but we'll, you can see there, you can see the cracks, you can see the lighting coming through, and just, it really creates an atmosphere to the animation. Really creates that emotional sort of connection. It's not a technical image by any means. You've got that nice soft lighting coming through. You've got the entropy that is quite visible in the concrete. It looks like it's been lived in. See if we can find the one that I actually wanted to show you, which was not that. Try again. Here we go. This was it right here. So yeah, you can see there just the attention to detail in the surfaces. Realistically, there's not a great deal of polys here, but it's just the way that the materials are created and laid out, and the really subtle lighting. And yeah, it just highlights the space, and it gives you a sense of presence. The fact that you could be there. So yeah, it's pretty impressive what you can do with the technology these days. We'll just let that go for the tick. But yeah, get back to the presentation. So yeah, there you go. You can UE for architecture visualization. So what programs are you going to use to get all this done? So generally, this is the sort of workflow that you use as a standard sort of procedure. You have a modeler, so you start off with some geometry, and then you import that geometry, what we call a base model, into a detailing sort of program, or use plugins. So that can be something like a sculpting program, like a ZBrush or a Mudbox, or it could be something like to add some 3D algorithmic texture, like a grasshopper. And then after that, you've got something that can create materials and textures. So you're looking at programs like Substance Painter and Substance Designer, and then finally you bring it into a rendering or animation engine like Unreal. So again, 3D modelers we were talking about before. So above you had the poly, and below you had the NURBS. So you can see Rhino below, which is what Dan's going to teach you, and Maya above, which is what I'll be teaching you. Yeah. So Rhino is a surface NURBS modeler. It has a regular sort of modeling interface where you can input numerical commands, like saying I want a square that's 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, and we'll do exactly that. You can do that to a greater or lesser extent in Maya as well, but Rhino's especially good for this. It is similar to Aliases as a Class A modeler. I should probably let Dan talk more about this, but considering I'm doing the recording here, I'll try and say what Dan would say, which is, it's the one-stop shop. It's the Swiss Army knife, if you will. It's got no bottlenecks. It's the perfect tool. It can do everything. And I wouldn't disagree with him, but as part of this course, you'll just be using it for what Dan needs you to do with it. As with all programs here, we're just teaching you a small snippet of it, and where you take them is up to you. It is optimized, again, for Class A physical models. So Class A is the highest form of surface finish, for lack of a better term, and in my mind is probably one of the most complex forms of modeling, second only to some complex engineering stuff that I won't go into. But yeah, it is right up there, and it is, if you can get good as a Class A modeler, as Rob will tell you, there are a lot of opportunities for you. Finally, it plugs in with Grasshopper. So Grasshopper exclusively runs through Rhino, I believe, and that's the generative program that you might be familiar with. If you've seen some incredible fractal mathematical patterns, chances are it was done with the help of either Grasshopper or MATLAB or something like that, but Grasshopper is definitely the weapon of choice for that. Increasingly, you're seeing it in everything from architecture to even car design, and I think Rob Veach might talk about that later on. But the other thing is that it works perfectly well with the wind tunnel sensors that Dan has created for this course. Maya is polygon modeler, regular modeling interface, similar to 3D Max, Blender, sort of 4D. Probably the most famous of those would be 3D Max. It's really similar to. Yeah, it's really optimized for games visualization and animation. So it's realistically, it's got a under the hood. It's very basic in terms of how it works. It's just being added onto over the years, but it's perfect for bringing assets or creating assets straight into Mudbox, where you can detail them up a little bit more, or alternatively, you can import them straight into Unreal Engine as a pipeline. But yeah, it's really great. You can even once you've UV mapped them, you can bring them straight into Substance as well. Substance Painter is into Substance Painter. So I think it's pretty versatile. It's no good if you're going to make physical models, in my opinion. Just to confuse everyone, you can 3D print STLs from Maya, but I would highly recommend against doing this. I would use programs like Rhino, which have some sort of dimensional accuracy. Maya is much better off. It's a much better tool for creating visual sort of models that can be used either in games, into interaction design, in animation. It's really, really good for that. Supplementary detail modeling and plugins. So the two that I've mentioned so far are Grasshopper and Mudbox. You can see in the background there, that's the Grasshopper. That's the algorithmic design that we're talking about. You know, you can get really complex sorts of forms and shapes out of that, and, you know, complex patterns and fractals and maths and, you know, all that good stuff. And in front of it, you can see there Mudbox, where you can see a sphere turning into a base model that you could create in something like Maya, and then you can then detail that geometry in Mudbox, the one that you see in the foreground with all like little scales and whatnot. To get to that point, though, both of these will need to go through a program called Unfold 3D. Unfold 3D is simply to create UV coordinates. Well, what are UV coordinates? Well, you'll notice that both of these aren't textured in any way. So have no materials applied to them. Materials are shaders which have been made with textures that are imported into the material to give it some sort of aesthetic finish. But we'll cover that a little bit later. So Mudbox is a detailer from Maya, similar to ZBrush, and it's digital sculpting. So you can actually use the Wacom tablets, and you'll find that most of the computers in building 100 with Wacoms attached to them have access to Mudbox. We'll speak to somebody to get the styluses available for you. But just know that you can sculpt directly onto the 3D model, which is kind of cool. As you can see there, that's the Mudbox sculpting at the foreground, and that's the kind of stuff that you can do. Grasshopper is an algorithmic modeling tool. So algorithms are mathematical expressions, and it's got a nodal and scripting interface, and it can create some pretty cool patterns. And Dan, the man, has been teaching that for many years, so he'll. It is not your standard sort of modeling interface. It's more of a nodal or scripted interface. If you're familiar with programs like Unreal, or if you're a touch designer, anything where you plug one command into the next, that is a nodal interface. I believe you can also script with Grasshopper if you wish. Whatever floats your boat. Whatever your background is, you'll probably gravitate to one or the other. Personally, as a designer, I find visual nodal networks work the best. So again, you can see there that's a Grasshopper expression behind that complex sort of 3D looking pattern behind the rocks there. Unfold is unfold. You'll use a bit which to create to prep geometry for Substance Painter. So as you've seen here, both of those have no materials applied to them. They're just pure white. It's just geometry you're seeing there. But when you want to apply a material made up of textures, you're going to need to project that onto a surface, and you're going to have to do that in a way that makes sense so the program can understand where you're painting to. And that brings into texturing. So as you can see here, we've got Substance Painter above and Substance Designer below. So Substance Designer, I'll start with that actually, which is really, you can see in the bottom right, you can see nodal network. Sorry, not in the bottom right. So bottom right is a is showing off a bump map. But to make the materials to go to paint on to surfaces, I use Substance Designer. So you can create complex materials made up of, again, algorithms, or you can be made up of images you've taken, or just materials in general. And Substance Painter, what you can see there is with the robotic mammoth there, you can see sections where it's being painted orange, like with some orange paint there, and it's like a little bit rusted and a little bit scratched. And you've got other sections which look like they're chrome alloy, and other sections where they look like they're powder coated. And really, so you can see, let's say, the orange from the grey to the dark grey to the metallic, you're using Substance Painter to mask off sections and to paint onto them. And then after that, you'll paint on, scratch maps and all that sort of stuff. But we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. But just to let you know, Substance Painters to paint on materials, and Substance Designer is to create materials. So materials tend to be made up of textures, which, your JPEG or your PNGs or whatever. Also, you pass that through a couple of algorithmic type filters, so that will have a nice tileable pattern for the material, so you can import them into Substance Painter and then apply them to your model as you see fit. Substance Painter, it's really similar to Photoshop. Again, compatible with a Wacom tablet that you have access to, but for it to work properly well, it needs to have UV map geometry. So you can't go directly, say, from Maya, Mudbox, or Grasshopper Rhino into Painter. You need to have an interim step where you map the UVs. So that's basically just mapping the coordinates. So when you paint onto the 3D form, it won't be stretched, it's not going to be warped, it's not going to look funny. Substance Designer is a nodal network interface, and that goes straight into Painter and Unreal Engine 4, and you create complex tileable patterns in there. And if you want some samples, you can always get them off share.algorithmic.com. So a lot of samples that you can kind of take down and reverse engineer and use as you wish. If you do, as I'll say throughout this course, if you do use any assets that are not your own and that you've modified them, just note it in the as you're making your folio, and also when you give us the files at the end. Failure to do so will lead into loss of marks, but also it's just bad form. And the other thing is, if you think you can get away with it, you probably can't. I've seen that many that many textures, that many materials, that many models that, it'll ring alarm bells where I see something that's that I've seen before. So again, don't risk it. If you modify it, I'm really happy for you to do that, especially early on, so you can kind of get some confidence and competence. But by no means should you, don't pass it off as your own. So Unreal's like where you'll bring all of these, Grasshopper, Rhino, Maya, Mudbox files, Substance Painter files into, and it will create a real-time rendering. The visualization, architecture visualization you saw before was all done in Unreal Engine. It's pretty powerful now. It creates pseudo physics for renderings and it's all guesstimated. So it's all simplified to create the illusion, a very realistic illusion that it's all real. And it's a great animation engine. The other thing that it does is it has particles that you can play with in real time. And we're going to play with them a little bit more next week. We've got a particle demo for you. But for those unfamiliar with particles, they look something like this. This is like the default set that you get. And they'll work in real time. So I personally think this is a great place to start if you want to visualize, wind and things of that nature. You can get them going around splines, or you can get them to interact and decay and really look quite impressive. And it's got some nice fake physics attached to them. So it's not real physics, it's not CFD by any means, but it kind of does the job in terms of creating that sort of really good illusion that people can take on as what would you say? It's a really good illusion that people can kind of get that feeling that it's wind or some sort of energy movement, for lack of a better term. Anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for the first presentation. I hope that sorts you out in terms of understanding the sort of path or workflow, basic sort of concepts of workflow that you'll be going throughout this course. When you email us, we'll email you back a link where to download all the programs from and all the plugins. You can always look this stuff up on Lynda as well, so it's worth checking out. Anyway, best of luck, and we'll get on to